He's meeting with his divorce attorney tomorrow at 2 p.m. to finalize the papers that will destroy my life. But what Trevor doesn't know is that at 6 a.m. this morning, I emptied our joint accounts and transferred everything to my personal offshore account in the Cayman Islands. 8 years of marriage teaches you a lot about patience, about listening through thin walls, and exactly how much damage you can do to someone who thinks you're too naive to fight back. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. As I sit here in our penthouse kitchen overlooking downtown Portland, carefully organizing the financial documents that will secure my future, I can't help but smile at the beautiful irony. Trevor thinks he's orchestrating the perfect financial ambush, a surprise divorce designed to leave me penniless while he walks away with everything we've built together. What he doesn't realize is that while he's been plotting my destruction, I've been systematically dismantling the very foundation he's standing on. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell me where you're watching from and if you've ever had to fight for what's rightfully yours. Because tomorrow I've prepared something that will teach Trevor Ashworth exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong woman. The discovery that shattered my world came exactly 72 hours ago, though the signs had been building for months like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Trevor had become secretive, taking calls in his home office with the door locked, speaking in hushed tones that carried the unmistakable cadence of conspiracy. As the founder and CEO of Ashworth Digital Marketing, he'd always been protective of client confidentiality. But this felt different, personal, urgent, and deliberately hidden from me. The irony of my situation isn't just that Trevor chose the wrong week to destroy me. It's that he has absolutely no comprehension of what's coming. Right now, he's probably in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, reviewing his strategy with that smug confidence he wears like expensive cologne. He's always been theatrical, my husband, treating every business negotiation like a performance where he holds all the cards and controls all the outcomes. But Trevor made one critical miscalculation in his timing. He decided to end our marriage exactly 24 hours after I discovered not only his plan, but also the extent of his financial preparations, and more devastatingly, the identity of his co-conspirator. My name is Victoria Sinclair, and until 3 days ago, I believed I was living the life I'd always dreamed of. Trevor and I met during our MBA program at Stanford, two ambitious students grinding through corporate finance and strategic management courses. He was magnetic, brilliant, devastatingly handsome, in that polished way that screams Silicon Valley success story. I was the scholarship recipient from small-town Oregon, working part-time at a tech startup to pay for textbooks and living expenses. He pursued me with the same methodical precision he'd later bring to building his marketing empire. Coffee dates at increasingly upscale cafes, weekend trips to Napa Valley, private dinners where he'd share his vision of building something revolutionary in the digital marketing space. I fell completely under his spell, seduced by his ambition and the promise of a partnership that would reshape both our futures. The proposal came during our final semester, a flawless 3-carat diamond presented at the same rooftop restaurant where we'd had our first real conversation about the future. "You complete my vision, Victoria," he'd said, and I believed every word. What I didn't understand then was that Trevor collected valuable assets, prime real estate, vintage cars, cutting-edge technology, and wives. And the thrill was always in the acquisition, never in the maintenance. Our early marriage was everything a partnership should be. Trevor's family wealth from their Portland real estate empire meant I could focus on building my career in financial consulting without the crushing student debt that had defined my entire academic experience. I landed a position at Cascade Financial Advisory, working with high-net-worth clients while Trevor launched his digital marketing firm from our converted warehouse loft in the Pearl District. We were building something extraordinary together, or so I thought. Trevor's business exploded with success, landing major clients like Nike, Columbia Sportswear, and several prominent tech startups. Within 5 years, Ashworth Digital Marketing had offices in Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco. I'd moved from financial consulting to becoming his unofficial CFO, managing the complex financial structures that supported his rapid expansion. The cracks in our foundations started small, forgotten anniversaries replaced by last-minute business trips, intimate dinners interrupted by urgent client calls, and a growing distance that he attributed to the pressures of building an empire. "You understand the sacrifice required for success?" he'd say whenever I expressed concern about our drifting relationship. "This is temporary. Once we reach the next level, we'll have time for everything." But 3 months ago, I began noticing patterns that had nothing to do with business growth. Credit card statements showing charges for restaurants I'd never visited, hotel stays during weekends when he claimed to be working late at the office, and most tellingly, a jewelry purchase for $4,800 on a Tuesday afternoon when he told me he was in back-to-back client meetings. The private investigator I hired was disturbingly thorough. Within 2 weeks, Natasha Reynolds had provided me with a comprehensive dossier that revealed the true scope of Trevor's deception. He wasn't just having an affair. He was systematically preparing for our divorce, moving assets, consulting attorneys, and building a narrative that would paint me as the unstable wife who'd become a liability to his continued success. The most devastating discovery wasn't the infidelity itself. It was learning the identity of his collaborator. Alexis Hammond, my former college roommate, my maid of honor, the person I'd confided every doubt and fear about my marriage to over wine-soaked evenings in our kitchen. The same woman who'd been texting me regularly, asking about my relationship, offering support, and expressing concern about my obvious unhappiness with such convincing sincerity. Alexis had always been the charming one, the networking genius, who could walk into any room and emerge with 3 new business connections and 5 social invitations. When I'd gotten into Stanford, she'd suddenly developed an interest in business school. When I'd started dating Trevor, she'd begun showing up at our study group sessions, always perfectly dressed, always asking the right questions about his entrepreneurial plans. But here's what neither Trevor nor Alexis anticipated. I'd been learning from the master for 8 years. Every business strategy session he'd conducted in our home office, every client negotiation he'd practiced aloud, every psychological manipulation technique he'd used to build his empire, I'd absorbed it all. The shy small-town girl he'd married had evolved into someone far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. And now, as Trevor prepares for what he believes will be his moment of triumph, he's about to discover that some students surpass their teachers. The financial fortress he's spent months building is about to crumble, and the naive wife he's planning to discard has become the architect of his complete destruction. Tomorrow's meeting with his divorce attorney will proceed exactly as planned. The only difference is that when Trevor arrives to finalize the papers that should have left me helpless, he'll discover that the accounts he's been counting on are empty, the assets he's been protecting are frozen, and the woman he's been underestimating has been 3 steps ahead of him all along. The game is about to begin, and for the first time in our marriage, I'm the one holding all the cards. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. To understand the full magnitude of what Trevor is attempting to destroy, you need to understand what we built together over 8 years of marriage. This wasn't just a relationship. It was a financial empire, a carefully constructed partnership that transformed two ambitious graduate students into one of Portland's most influential power couples. We met during the second semester of our MBA program at Stanford, in Professor Williams' Advanced Corporate Strategy seminar. I was the scholarship student from Bend, Oregon, working nights at a Silicon Valley startup to afford textbooks and basic living expenses. Trevor was the golden boy from Portland's old money Ashworth family, whose real estate empire had been shaping the Pacific Northwest skyline for 3 generations. We shouldn't have had anything in common, but corporate strategy has a way of revealing how minds work, and I found his approach fascinating. While other students focused on theoretical frameworks, Trevor thought like a battlefield commander, always 3 moves ahead, always calculating risk versus reward with mathematical precision. He pursued me with the same relentless methodology he brought to everything else. Fresh coffee appeared on my desk before early morning classes. Study guides materialized for our most challenging exams. And somehow my crushing part-time work schedule became manageable when Trevor started needing help with projects that paid surprisingly well. You see patterns that others miss, he told me after I'd identified a market gap that became the foundation for his first business plan. You think like a financial detective, not just an analyst. That's invaluable. I fell in love with his vision first, then his confidence, and finally his apparent genuine respect for my intelligence. In a world where I constantly felt like an outsider looking in, Trevor made me feel like an essential partner in something extraordinary. The proposal came during our final semester, at the rooftop restaurant, where we'd spent countless hours planning our post-graduation strategy. No grand gestures or public displays, just the 2 of us overlooking the Bay Area lights, surrounded by business plans and financial projections that had become our shared language. "We're unstoppable together," he said, sliding the ring box across the table between our laptops and coffee cups. "You ground my ambitions, and I can provide the resources to make your brilliance shine. This isn't just marriage. It's the ultimate strategic partnership." I believed him completely. The ring was perfect. Elegant without being flashy. Substantial without being ostentatious. Exactly what I would have chosen if I'd dared to dream that big. When I slipped it on, it felt like signing a contract for a future I'd never imagined possible. Our early marriage was everything a business partnership should be. Trevor's family wealth meant I could focus on building my expertise in financial consulting, without the crushing debt that had defined my entire academic experience. I landed a prestigious position at Cascade Financial Advisory, working with high-net-worth clients while Trevor launched Ashworth Digital Marketing from our converted warehouse loft in Portland's Pearl District. The loft itself became a symbol of our partnership, 4,000 square feet of exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that we'd transformed into both our home and the headquarters of Trevor's growing empire. I handled all the financial architecture, while he focused on client acquisition and creative strategy. We worked 18-hour days, ate takeout over spreadsheets, and celebrated every major client victory like we'd won the lottery. Those first 3 years were intoxicating. Trevor's business exploded with success, landing accounts with Nike, Columbia Sportswear, and several prominent tech startups whose IPOs we'd helped orchestrate through strategic digital campaigns. I'd evolved from financial consultant to his unofficial CFO, designing the complex financial structures that supported his rapid expansion while maintaining my own client base at Cascade. By our 5th anniversary, we weren't just successful, we were influential. Ashworth Digital Marketing had offices in Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco, employing over 60 people and generating annual revenues that placed us among the Pacific Northwest's fastest-growing companies. I'd been promoted to senior partner at Cascade Financial Advisory, managing portfolios worth over $200 million. We moved from the Pearl District loft to a stunning penthouse in downtown Portland, all glass and steel, with panoramic views of Mount Hood and the Willamette River. Our combined annual income exceeded $2.3 million, not including Trevor's family trust distributions and the equity value of his rapidly expanding business. The social recognition followed the financial success. We were featured in Portland Monthly as Power Couple of the Year, invited to exclusive charity galas, and asked to speak at Stanford's alumni events about entrepreneurial partnerships in marriage. Trevor served on the boards of 3 nonprofit organizations while I was appointed to the Governor's Small Business Advisory Council. But more than the money or recognition, what made our partnership extraordinary was the intellectual synergy. Trevor would present a client challenge, and I'd design the financial strategy to support his creative solution. He'd identify a market opportunity, and I'd structure the investment approach to minimize risk while maximizing growth potential. We spoke in a shared language of profit margins, market penetration, and strategic positioning that made us formidable in any business environment. Our investment portfolio reflected this collaboration. Trevor's instinct for emerging markets, combined with my risk assessment expertise, had built us a diversified portfolio worth over $4.7 million. We owned rental properties in 3 states, held significant equity positions in 12 startups, and maintained multiple investment accounts across various asset classes. The penthouse wasn't just our home, it was our fortress. State-of-the-art security systems, a home office that rivaled most corporate boardrooms, and enough space to entertain Portland's business elite in the style they expected from the Ashworth name. We'd hosted campaign fundraisers for city council candidates, strategy sessions for nonprofit boards, and intimate dinners where deals worth millions were negotiated over wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Friends and colleagues saw us as the perfect partnership, 2 brilliant minds that had multiplied each other's capabilities rather than competing for dominance. The Sinclairs, people would say, recognizing that I'd kept my maiden name for professional reasons while everyone understood we were a unified force in business and society. What no one realized, including me until 3 months ago, was that Trevor had been documenting every aspect of our financial success with the methodical precision of someone planning an eventual separation. Every asset we'd built together, every investment decision I'd contributed to, every strategic advantage my expertise had provided, he'd been calculating how to claim it all as his individual achievement. The man who'd convinced me that we were building something eternal together had actually been preparing for my elimination from day one. Our partnership hadn't been the foundation of our success. It had been my audition for a role that would eventually be terminated when Trevor found someone who offered better advantages. Tomorrow's meeting with his divorce attorney represents Trevor's attempt to conclude the longest and most profitable business transaction of his career, using my expertise to build an empire, then discarding me while keeping everything we'd created together. But Trevor made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that the woman who'd helped him build his financial fortress didn't understand its vulnerabilities. He forgot that I hadn't just been observing his success. I'd been architecting it. And now, the student who'd learned every one of his strategic methodologies was about to demonstrate exactly what happens when superior financial expertise meets perfect timing and absolute fury. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared on a rainy Tuesday evening in February, though I wouldn't recognize its significance until months later when all the pieces finally clicked into place. Trevor had always been methodical about his schedule, almost obsessively so, but that night he broke a pattern that had been consistent for 3 years. Every Tuesday we had what we called portfolio review dinners, intimate evenings where we'd discuss our investments, analyze market trends, and plan our financial strategies over expensive wine and carefully prepared meals. It was sacred time, a tradition that had never been interrupted by clients, emergencies, or social obligations. Trevor had canceled important business meetings to preserve these Tuesday evenings, claiming they were essential to maintaining our competitive edge. But that particular Tuesday, he came home 40 minutes late with an elaborate story about a last-minute client crisis that required his immediate attention. The client was supposedly launching a major product campaign and needed emergency strategy consultation that couldn't wait until morning. "You know how these tech startups operate," he said, pouring himself a scotch with hands that seemed slightly unsteady. "When they panic, they need immediate reassurance, or they'll jump to another agency. I couldn't risk losing them over a scheduling conflict." The explanation was perfectly reasonable, delivered with his usual confidence, but something felt wrong. Trevor's phone, which usually buzzed constantly with client communications, had been completely silent during his explanation. For a man supposedly managing a crisis, he seemed remarkably disconnected from the urgent situation he'd described. More troubling was his behavior during our abbreviated portfolio review. Trevor, who normally dissected every investment decision with analytical precision, seemed distracted and eager to conclude our discussion quickly. When I mentioned concerns about our tech sector exposure, he waved off my analysis with uncharacteristic dismissiveness. "Your conservative approach is holding us back," he said, which was completely contrary to every conversation we'd had about risk management over the past 5 years. "Sometimes you have to trust market momentum instead of overthinking every variable." This was the same man who'd spent hours debating the wisdom of increasing our Microsoft position by 2%. His sudden appetite for risk felt like talking to a stranger wearing my husband's face. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Tuesday evening, emergencies became a regular occurrence, each accompanied by increasingly elaborate explanations about client demands and market pressures. Trevor's phone behavior changed dramatically. Devices that had once been casually accessible became objects he guarded with paranoid intensity. He'd started taking calls on our bedroom balcony, speaking in voice barely above a whisper despite being 30 floors above street level. When I'd ask about these conversations, he'd cite client confidentiality with a rigidity that felt more like defensive deflection than professional discretion. "You're being paranoid, Victoria," he'd say when I expressed concern about his secretive behavior. "Success creates pressure, and pressure requires privacy. Not every business conversation needs to be public knowledge, even within our marriage." But it wasn't just the phone calls. Trevor's entire relationship with technology became suspicious. He'd started changing passwords on devices we'd previously shared, claiming security upgrades were necessary due to increased cyber threats against successful businesses. Our shared laptop, which had always been communal property for managing our joint investments, suddenly required his personal authorization for access. His travel schedule, which had always been transparent and collaborative, became deliberately vague. Weekend business trips that had once included detailed itineraries and client contact information were now described in broad strokes that resisted specific inquiry. "I'll be in San Francisco for strategic planning meetings," he'd say, refusing to provide details about which clients or what strategies were being discussed. "The NDAs are so restrictive that I can't discuss specifics until the deals are finalized." March brought more disturbing changes in his personal habits. Trevor, who had always been naturally confident, began displaying behavior that suggested he was actively working to impress someone whose approval he desperately needed. He started working out with personal trainer intensity, upgraded his wardrobe with clothes that were more stylish than his usual conservative business attire, and began paying attention to grooming details he'd ignored for years. "I need to look the part for these high-level negotiations," he explained when I commented on his suddenly fashionable appearance. "Image matters more than substance in client relations." If I want to compete with the younger agencies, I need to project energy and relevance. But the most unsettling change was in our physical relationship. Trevor had become almost studiously romantic, but in a way that felt performative rather than genuine. Flowers appeared regularly, expensive dinners were scheduled with theatrical precision, and our conversations were peppered with compliments that sounded like lines from a script, rather than spontaneous expressions of affection. "You're so understanding about the demands of my business," he'd say, stroking my hair with movements that felt rehearsed. Not every wife would be supportive of the sacrifices required for this level of success. The phrasing always bothered me. Not every wife suggested he was comparing me to other wives, but which wives? Our social circle consisted primarily of other successful couples, and Trevor had never shown interest in analyzing their relationship dynamics. Who was providing this comparative framework? Financial irregularities began appearing in April, subtle at first but increasingly bold, as Trevor apparently grew more confident in his deception. Our joint credit card statement showed charges for restaurants I'd never heard of, always during times when Trevor claimed to be in client meetings or working late at the office. When I questioned these expenses, he'd provide detailed explanations about business entertainment requirements and the importance of maintaining relationships with key influencers in the digital marketing ecosystem. The explanations were so thorough, so professionally justified, that questioning them further would have seemed petty and suspicious. But the amounts were troubling. $380 for dinner at Le Bernardin during a supposed client crisis that required Trevor's immediate attention. $520 for wine service at restaurants, known more for romantic ambiance than business networking. These weren't corporate entertainment expenses. They were courtship investments. The jewelry purchase that finally triggered my serious investigation appeared on our May statement. $4,800 charged to Whitman Jewelers on a Tuesday afternoon when Trevor had supposedly been in back-to-back client presentations. When I asked about it directly, his explanation was smooth and immediate. "Anniversary gift planning," he said without missing a beat. "I wanted to surprise you with something special for our upcoming anniversary, so I've been working with their designer on a custom piece." The charge was for the deposit and initial design consultation. Our anniversary was still 4 months away, and Trevor had never shown interest in custom jewelry or advanced gift planning. But questioning his romantic gesture would have made me seem ungrateful and suspicious. He'd positioned the lie perfectly, making any follow-up inquiry feel like emotional sabotage. May also brought changes in his social behavior that felt deliberately designed to create distance between us. Trevor began accepting invitations to events that had previously been automatic joint appearances, claiming that certain business functions were more effective for networking when attended solo. "You understand how these industry gatherings work," he'd say, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror with unusual attention to his appearance. "Sometimes the conversations flow better in a bachelor environment. Married men are perceived as less available for certain types of business partnerships." None of this made sense based on 8 years of experience in Portland's business community, where successful couples were typically seen as more stable and trustworthy than single entrepreneurs. But Trevor's explanations were delivered with such confident authority that questioning them felt like challenging his professional expertise. The most disturbing development was his sudden interest in our financial documentation. Trevor began asking detailed questions about our asset distribution, investment account structures, and legal ownership of various properties. He claimed this interest was motivated by estate planning concerns and tax optimization strategies. "We need to ensure our financial structure is properly organized," he'd say, reviewing documents with unusual intensity. "Successful couples require sophisticated asset protection strategies. I want to make sure everything is legally bulletproof." But his questions focused specifically on which assets were held in my name individually versus our joint accounts, and he seemed particularly interested in understanding how quickly various investments could be liquidated if necessary. These weren't estate planning conversations. They were reconnaissance missions. By June, the pattern was undeniable. Trevor wasn't just distracted by business pressures or going through a midlife-style evolution. He was systematically preparing for something that required secrecy, financial planning, and the cultivation of relationships I wasn't supposed to know about. The Tuesday evening that changed everything was June 15th, when Trevor's latest client emergency excuse finally fell apart under the weight of its own impossibilities. He claimed to be managing a crisis for a tech startup that needed immediate damage control for a social media disaster, but when I checked the company's online presence, their social media accounts showed no recent activity, no crisis communications, and no indication of any problems requiring emergency consultation. For the first time in our marriage, I knew with absolute certainty that Trevor was lying to me about something significant. What I didn't yet understand was that his lies weren't just about where he was spending his Tuesday evenings. They were about every aspect of our future together. That night, as Trevor slept peacefully beside me after another successful deception, I made the decision that would ultimately save my financial life. I hired a private investigator to discover exactly what my husband was planning and why he needed to hide it from the woman who'd helped him build everything he was now apparently preparing to lose. The moment that shattered my world arrived with the cruel banality of a forgotten coffee cup on a Tuesday morning that would divide my life into before and after. Trevor had left for his usual morning run through Waterfront Park, a precisely timed 45-minute routine that had remained consistent for 6 years. I was searching for our tax preparation documents in his home office, specifically the quarterly business expense reports we'd need for our accountant's appointment that afternoon. Trevor's office was his sanctuary, a carefully organized space with mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, and filing systems that reflected his obsessive attention to detail. He'd always been protective of his workspace, citing attorney-client privilege even though he wasn't practicing law, but he'd never explicitly forbidden my access. The room represented his success, his control, and his assumption that I would never have reason to investigate its contents. I found the tax documents exactly where they should have been, neatly arranged in the filing cabinet's second drawer labeled Financial Records 2023. But as I reached for the folder containing our charitable contribution receipts, my hand brushed against something that didn't belong in that section. A manila envelope labeled with handwriting that made my blood freeze. Project Exodus, Timeline and Documentation. Project Exodus. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, carrying implications that my analytical mind immediately began processing. Exodus meant departure, escape, liberation from bondage. In Trevor's methodical world, projects had timelines, budgets, and clearly defined objectives. This wasn't a business venture. This was a plan for leaving. My hands trembled as I pulled the envelope from its hiding place, knowing that whatever I found inside would fundamentally alter everything I believed about my marriage, my future, and the man I'd trusted with both. The envelope was thick, heavy with documentation that suggested months of preparation, and sealed with the kind of professional precision Trevor brought to his most important business proposals. Inside, the first document was a timeline printed on Trevor's company letterhead, titled Project Exodus Implementation Schedule. The clinical language made my skin crawl as I read dates, objectives, and milestones that treated the destruction of our marriage like a corporate restructuring project. Phase 1, Asset Documentation and Legal Consultation, completed March 15th. Phase 2, Financial Positioning and Account Preparation, completed May 30th. Phase 3, Relationship Documentation and Evidence Collection, ongoing. Phase 4, Legal Filing and Public Announcement, scheduled July 15th. Phase 5, Transition Management and New Life Implementation, July 16th to September 1st. July 15th was 3 weeks away. Trevor had been planning my elimination with the same methodical precision he brought to his most challenging client campaigns, treating our 8-year marriage as a project to be concluded on schedule, with maximum efficiency and minimum complications. The asset documentation was devastating in its thoroughness. Trevor had been cataloging our joint possessions, investments, and properties with forensic detail, but the analysis wasn't neutral. It was strategic. Each asset was categorized as individual achievement, joint investment, or transition liability. Anything I'd contributed to our financial success had been reclassified as joint investment, while his business assets were individual achievements that should remain with him post-divorce. Our Cascade Financial Advisory partnership, which I'd built from entry-level analyst to senior partner, was listed as a joint investment requiring equitable division. The rental properties we'd purchased using my market analysis and his capital were categorized as, quote, joint investments with disputed contribution ratios. Even the penthouse, which we'd bought together using proceeds from both our careers, was described as, quote, primary asset requiring careful documentation of individual versus joint contributions. But Trevor's business, Ashworth Digital Marketing, was classified as his, quote, individual achievement with minimal spousal contribution. The company I'd helped structure financially, the client strategies I'd supported with financial analysis, the growth I'd enabled through careful cash flow management, all of it had been redefined as his personal accomplishment that should remain untouched by divorce proceedings. The legal consultation notes were equally chilling. Trevor had been meeting with Harrison Mills, of Mills and Associates, one of Portland's most aggressive divorce attorneys, since early March. The strategy sessions were documented with military precision, focusing on how to minimize my financial claim while maximizing his asset protection. Client seeks rapid resolution with minimal financial exposure. One note read, wife lacks independent legal representation and business sophistication. Strategy: present divorce as mutual decision with predetermined settlement terms. Avoid extended litigation by controlling narrative and timeline. They were counting on my supposed naivete, my lack of legal sophistication, and my emotional attachment to our marriage to accept whatever terms they offered. Trevor had been studying me like a business competitor, analyzing my weaknesses and blind spots to ensure his victory would be swift and complete. The relationship documentation was the most personally devastating section. Trevor had been keeping detailed records of our private conversations, arguments, and intimate moments, but not as cherished memories, as evidence for his divorce case. Every disagreement about business strategy was reframed as evidence of my inadequate understanding of entrepreneurial demands. Every expression of concern about his secretive behavior was documented as evidence of my suspicious and controlling nature. Victoria displays increasing jealousy regarding business travel and client relationships, one entry noted. Unable to understand demands of high-level entrepreneurship. Emotional reactions inappropriate for executive spouse role. Growing liability for business relationships and client development. He'd been building a psychological profile designed to paint me as an unstable wife whose emotional inadequacies threatened his professional success. Every vulnerable moment I'd shared, every honest conversation about my insecurities in Portland's elite business community, had been weaponized against me. But the discovery that transformed my shock into pure fury was the communication log hidden behind the legal documents. Trevor had been coordinating his project with someone who had access to intimate details about our marriage, our finances, and my personal vulnerabilities. The emails were signed simply AH, but the content made the identity unmistakable. Trevor, Victoria asked about the jewelry charge again today. I told her you were probably planning something romantic for your anniversary. She seemed satisfied, but you need to be more careful about covering these expenses. -AH. The emotional manipulation is working perfectly. She's becoming increasingly paranoid about your behavior but still trusts me completely. I can continue feeding you information about her concerns and reactions. -RAH. Victoria mentioned she's worried about your late meetings. I suggested she's being overly sensitive about normal business pressures. She's so grateful for my support that she tells me everything. This is almost too easy. AH. Alexis Hammond. My former roommate, my maid of honor, my closest confidant for over a decade. The woman I'd called when I first noticed Trevor's suspicious behavior, seeking advice and emotional support. The same woman who'd been reporting every word of those conversations back to my husband, helping him stay ahead of my concerns and adjust his deception accordingly. I'd been living with two people systematically dismantling my life while I trusted them both completely. Trevor had been planning my financial destruction, while Alexis collected intelligence to ensure his success. They'd been coordinating my elimination like a hostile corporate takeover, with me as the unwitting target. The final document in the envelope was a lease agreement for a luxury apartment in the South Waterfront District, signed by both Trevor Ashworth and Alexis Hammond, dated June 1st. They weren't just planning my divorce. They were already building their life together in a space that represented everything I was losing. The apartment was stunning. 2 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, amenities that screamed success and sophistication. It was the kind of place Trevor and I might have chosen together for a weekend getaway, except he'd chosen it as his escape from our marriage, with my former best friend as his new partner. As I sat in Trevor's leather chair, surrounded by the evidence of their systematic betrayal, I felt something crystallize inside me that was far more dangerous than anger or heartbreak. This wasn't just personal betrayal, this was strategic warfare, conducted with cold precision against someone they'd assumed would be too naive and trusting to fight back. But Trevor and Alexis had made one critical miscalculation. They'd spent months studying my weaknesses while completely underestimating my strengths. The financial expertise they'd dismissed as supporting their ambitions was about to become the foundation for their destruction. I carefully photographed every document with my phone, ensuring I had copies of their entire plan, their timeline, their strategies, and their communications. They'd handed me a comprehensive blueprint for their attack, but they'd also given me something far more valuable: time to prepare my counteroffensive. Trevor's Project Exodus was scheduled for implementation in 3 weeks. He had no idea that while he'd been planning my elimination, he'd actually been providing me with everything I needed to orchestrate his complete destruction. The student was about to teach the master what happened when you underestimated someone who'd been taking careful notes for 8 years. As I replaced the envelope exactly where I'd found it, ensuring nothing appeared disturbed, I realized that Trevor and Alexis were about to learn a fundamental lesson about strategic warfare. The most devastating attacks come from opponents who appear to be defenseless, right up until the moment they destroy everything you thought you knew about winning. The true scope of Trevor and Alexis's conspiracy revealed itself over the following 48 hours, as I conducted my own forensic investigation into every aspect of our lives that I'd previously taken for granted. What I'd initially assumed was a recent affair with an opportunistic accomplice turned out to be a systematic, long-term infiltration that had been reshaping my reality for over 2 years. Using the login credentials I'd discovered in Trevor's Project Exodus documentation, I gained access to email accounts, financial records, and communication channels that painted a picture of betrayal so comprehensive it took my breath away. They hadn't just been planning my divorce, they'd been orchestrating the complete reconstruction of my life to serve their shared agenda. The email thread between Trevor and Alexis stretched back to January 2022, starting innocuously enough with casual exchanges about business networking and social events. But even those early messages contained undertones that, viewed through my new lens of awareness, revealed their true collaborative intent. "Victoria seems really stressed about your travel schedule lately," Alexis had written in February 2022. "Maybe I should suggest she take up some hobbies to keep herself occupied? Photography classes. Yoga, something that gets her out of the house so she's not tracking your every movement." Trevor's response was chillingly strategic. Perfect suggestion. "The more independent activities she develops, the easier it'll be to establish that we've grown apart naturally. Document any activities you get her involved in. We'll need evidence of her separate interests for the incompatibility narrative." They'd been manufacturing evidence of our marital problems while simultaneously creating the very conditions that would justify their predetermined conclusion. Every suggestion Alexis made about my personal development, every encouragement to pursue individual interests, every piece of advice about giving Trevor space for his business growth had been calculated to build a case against our marriage. The financial coordination was even more disturbing. Alexis had been receiving monthly payments from Trevor since March 2022, initially disguised as consulting fees for business development services, but actually compensation for her role as an intelligence operative within my personal life. The amounts started at $2,000 per month and gradually increased to $5,000 by January 2023, reflecting her growing importance to his long-term strategy. But Alexis wasn't just collecting information. She'd been actively sabotaging opportunities that might have strengthened my independence or increased my awareness of Trevor's deception. When I'd been offered a partnership position at Meridian Wealth Management that would have doubled my income and expanded my professional network, Alexis had convinced me to decline. "You're already so successful at Cascade," she'd argued during a wine-soaked evening in our penthouse kitchen. "Why complicate your life with new office politics and demanding clients? You and Trevor have such a perfect balance right now. Don't risk disrupting something that's working so beautifully." Her advice had seemed wise and supportive at the time, focused on protecting the harmony of my marriage and career. Now I realized she'd been preventing me from developing the kind of professional independence that would have made me a more formidable opponent in divorce proceedings. The sabotage extended to my social relationships as well. Several friendships that might have provided emotional support or professional connections had been systematically undermined through Alexis's subtle interventions. When Jennifer Morrison, a successful family law attorney, had invited me to join her book club, Alexis had discouraged my participation. "Jennifer's group is so cliquey and competitive," she'd warned. "All they do is gossip about each other's marriages and judge everyone else's choices. You don't need that kind of negative energy in your life, especially when things are going so well with Trevor." I'd trusted her judgment and declined Jennifer's invitation, missing an opportunity to develop a friendship with exactly the kind of legal professional who might have recognized the warning signs of my husband's preparation for divorce. The coordination between Trevor and Alexis had been seamless and sophisticated. They'd developed a comprehensive system for monitoring my activities, emotions, and concerns, then using that intelligence to stay ahead of any suspicions that might threaten their timeline. When I'd started questioning Trevor's Tuesday evening absences, Alexis had been prepared with alternative explanations that redirected my concerns. "Successful men need space to decompress from business pressures," she'd counseled. "The fact that he's home with you most nights shows how committed he is to your marriage. Don't let anxiety about a few work meetings undermine your trust in him." When I'd noticed financial irregularities in our credit card statements, she'd provided context that made my concerns seem petty and suspicious. "Every marriage requires trust about money," she'd reminded me. "Trevor handles business expenses that you don't always need to understand." Micromanaging his professional spending will just create unnecessary tension. Every intervention had been perfectly timed and expertly calibrated to maintain my trust while preventing me from taking actions that might have exposed their deception. They'd been playing psychological chess with my emotions and instincts, always staying 3 moves ahead of my natural protective responses. But perhaps the most devastating discovery was the depth of Alexis's infiltration into my emotional life. She hadn't just been collecting information about my marriage. She'd been actively shaping my psychological state to serve their strategic objectives. The therapy sessions she'd recommended when I'd expressed concerns about feeling disconnected from Trevor weren't meant to help me. They were designed to create documentation of my emotional instability that could be used in divorce proceedings. Dr. Sarah Chen, the therapist Alexis had researched for me, was actually someone Trevor had consulted about building a psychological profile that would support his narrative of my inadequacy as a corporate spouse. Victoria presents with classic symptoms of adjustment anxiety related to lifestyle changes, Dr. Chen's notes indicated. Difficulty adapting to increased social demands of spouse's business success. Recommend individual therapy to address personal growth issues that may be impacting marital harmony. The therapy sessions I'd attended, believing they would help me become a better partner, had actually been generating professional documentation of my psychological unfitness for the lifestyle Trevor's success required. Every vulnerable admission I'd made about feeling out of place in Portland's elite business community had been recorded as evidence of my inadequacy. Even my physical health had been manipulated to serve their agenda. The nutritionist Alexis had recommended, the personal trainer she'd insisted would help me feel more confident, the wellness retreats she'd encouraged me to attend, all had been designed to document my need for extensive self-improvement that would support Trevor's claim that I'd become a high-maintenance liability requiring constant management. The email exchanges revealed discussions about my appearance, my social skills, and my professional capabilities that were so clinical and dismissive they felt like performance reviews for a failing employee. They'd been dissecting every aspect of my personality and behavior, looking for ammunition to justify my termination from Trevor's life. Victoria's anxiety about networking events is becoming more obvious, Trevor had written to Alexis in November 2022. She tries to hide it, but you can see the stress when she has to interact with high-level clients. It's becoming embarrassing in business settings. Alexis's response had been equally cruel. I've been working on her confidence issues, but she's fundamentally uncomfortable with the sophistication level required for your social circle. She's trying, but it's like watching someone play a role they're not naturally suited for. They'd been evaluating my performance as Trevor's wife like employers assessing a worker who was no longer meeting job requirements. Every social event, every business dinner, every interaction with Trevor's colleagues had been a test I was failing according to standards they'd never communicated but had been documenting for future use. The timeline coordination showed that they'd been preparing for my replacement with the same methodical precision Trevor brought to his most complex client campaigns. Alexis hadn't just been undermining my marriage, she'd been auditioning for the role of Trevor's next wife while helping him document why I was unsuitable for the position. But the most chilling discovery was their discussion of post-divorce scenarios that revealed how completely they'd planned my elimination from their social circle and professional network. They'd identified which friends would likely choose sides and developed strategies for ensuring those choices favored them. They'd analyzed which business relationships I might try to maintain and prepared narratives that would make those connections uncomfortable or impossible. Victoria will probably try to maintain her relationship with the Stanford Alumni Network, Alexis had predicted. We need to make sure our version of the divorce reaches them first. Frame it as Trevor finally having the courage to end a marriage that was holding back his potential. Trevor had agreed with enthusiasm. The key is making it clear that this was inevitable, not sudden. Everyone in our circle has seen how unsuited she is for the demands of real success. They'll understand why I had to make this difficult decision. They'd been planning not just my divorce, but my complete social and professional exile from the life we'd built together. They wanted to ensure that when their new relationship went public, everyone in our shared world would view it as a logical upgrade rather than a betrayal. As I sat in our penthouse overlooking the city where I'd thought I belonged, surrounded by evidence of the most sophisticated personal betrayal I could have imagined, I realized that Trevor and Alexis had underestimated one crucial factor in their comprehensive strategy. They'd spent 2 years analyzing my weaknesses and vulnerabilities while completely ignoring my strengths. The financial expertise they'd dismissed as supporting their ambitions, the analytical skills they'd overlooked as mere detail management, and the strategic thinking they'd undervalued as feminine intuition were about to become the foundation for their complete destruction. They'd handed me a detailed blueprint of their conspiracy, but they'd also revealed something far more valuable. They believed themselves to be intellectually superior to someone who'd been quietly studying their methods, while they'd been busy celebrating their own cleverness. The student was about to remind the teachers what happened when you spent so much time planning someone's destruction that you forgot to protect yourself from retaliation. The transformation from devastated victim to calculating strategist happened with startling clarity as I absorbed the full implications of what Trevor and Alexis had taught me through their own systematic betrayal. For 2 years, they'd been providing me with an advanced education in manipulation, psychological warfare, and strategic deception, lessons I'd unknowingly absorbed while they'd assumed I was too naive to understand the curriculum. Sitting in my home office overlooking the Portland skyline, I realized that every technique they'd used against me could be reversed and amplified. They'd shown me how to infiltrate someone's life, how to manipulate their decision-making, how to document their vulnerabilities, and how to coordinate complex deceptions across multiple fronts. More importantly, they demonstrated their own weaknesses, blind spots, and overconfidence that I could exploit. The first principle of effective counterstrategy is understanding your opponent's assumptions about your capabilities. Trevor and Alexis believed they were dealing with someone whose emotional responses were predictable, whose professional expertise was limited to supporting roles, and whose strategic thinking was inferior to their own. This fundamental misassessment would become the foundation of their destruction. My financial expertise, which they'd dismissed as basic bookkeeping and risk management, actually encompassed sophisticated understanding of asset protection, international banking, and complex investment structures. 8 years of managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions had taught me how money moved, how it could be hidden, and most importantly, how it could be weaponized against people who assumed they were financially invulnerable. The private investigator I'd contacted, Marcus Chen, was someone I'd worked with during my early years at Cascade Financial Advisory when we'd needed to verify the authenticity of potential clients' claimed assets. Marcus specialized in financial forensics and had connections throughout the international banking community that made him invaluable for complex investigations involving sophisticated financial deception. "I need comprehensive documentation of a systematic fraud case," I told him during our meeting at a downtown coffee shop, far from our usual social circles. "2 individuals have been coordinating to steal assets worth approximately $8 million through fraudulent means, and I need evidence that will stand up in both civil and criminal proceedings." Marcus understood immediately that this wasn't a standard adultery investigation. Financial fraud involving coordinated deception across multiple years suggests RICO predicate activities, he noted, referring to federal racketeering statutes. If we can document conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering components, this becomes a federal case with serious criminal implications. The beauty of approaching this as a financial crimes investigation rather than a marital dispute was that it transformed my emotional devastation into professional analytical work. Instead of being the wounded wife seeking revenge, I became the forensic financial analyst building a case against sophisticated criminals who'd made the mistake of targeting someone with superior expertise in their chosen method of attack. Trevor's business structure, which I'd helped design for legitimate tax optimization, could be analyzed to reveal the fraudulent asset transfers he'd been conducting in preparation for our divorce. The consulting payments to Alexis, the personal expenses disguised as business costs, and the systematic movement of marital assets into accounts I couldn't access, all constituted documentable fraud that exposed him to both civil liability and criminal prosecution. But more importantly, Trevor's arrogance had led him to use business infrastructure for personal deception that created a paper trail any competent forensic accountant could follow. Every payment to Alexis had been processed through his business accounts, creating tax documentation that would have to be explained to the IRS when they discovered he'd been claiming personal conspiracy expenses as legitimate business costs. My strategy needed to accomplish three primary objectives: secure our joint assets before Trevor could complete his theft, document his criminal activity in ways that would result in serious legal consequences, and position myself advantageously for both the divorce proceedings and the inevitable criminal investigation that would follow. The asset protection phase required immediate but careful action. Moving too quickly would alert Trevor that I'd discovered his plan, but waiting too long would allow him to complete his own asset transfers. I needed to secure our wealth in ways that appeared routine and normal, while actually rendering his financial strategy completely ineffective. Using my authorization on our joint investment accounts, I began a systematic restructuring that appeared to be standard portfolio rebalancing but actually moved liquid assets into accounts Trevor couldn't access. The international investment fund I had recommended 2 years earlier for tax diversification became the perfect vehicle for moving substantial amounts overseas, where they'd be protected from Trevor's planned seizure. The offshore account in the Cayman Islands, which we'd established for legitimate international investment purposes, provided the perfect sanctuary for assets Trevor assumed would remain available for his use. By restructuring our holdings to favor international funds and foreign currency positions, I could move millions beyond his reach while appearing to make sophisticated investment decisions rather than defensive maneuvers. Meanwhile, I began documenting Trevor's fraudulent activities with the methodical precision he'd always admired in my professional work. Every business expense that had actually been personal, every asset transfer that had bypassed my legal rights, every communication with Alexis that revealed their conspiracy, all of it was cataloged and cross-referenced for maximum impact in both civil and criminal proceedings. The psychological component of my strategy required the most sophisticated planning. Trevor and Alexis needed to remain confident in their deception, while I gathered evidence and positioned myself for their destruction. This meant continuing to play the role of the unsuspecting wife while actually conducting a comprehensive investigation of their criminal enterprise. The performance required emotional discipline that 8 years of marriage to Trevor had prepared me for perfectly. Every family dinner where I'd smiled through his condescending explanations of business concepts I understood better than he did, every social event where I'd played the supportive spouse while actually analyzing the room for strategic opportunities, every private moment where I'd maintained composure while he unknowingly revealed his own vulnerabilities, all had been training for this ultimate test of psychological endurance. But the key insight that transformed my strategy from defensive to offensive was understanding that Trevor and Alexis had created their own destruction through their overconfidence and assumption of my incompetence. They'd left evidence of their conspiracy everywhere because they believed I was too naive to recognize it, too emotionally dependent to challenge it, and too professionally limited to counter it effectively. Their communications, their financial transactions, their coordination of my manipulation, all had been conducted with the casual openness of people who believed their victim was intellectually inferior to their methods. This arrogance had created a comprehensive record of criminal activity that any competent prosecutor would recognize as a textbook case of conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The timeline for my counteroffensive needed to be precisely calibrated to inflict maximum damage at the moment when Trevor believed he was achieving victory. His Project Exodus schedule called for legal filing and public announcement on July 15th, which meant he'd expect to control the narrative and catch me unprepared for complex legal warfare. Instead, July 15th would become the day Trevor discovered that his victim had become his prosecutor, his financial victim had become his most dangerous opponent, and his assumed intellectual superiority had blinded him to the sophisticated counter-strategy that would destroy everything he'd spent 2 years planning. The private investigator's preliminary findings confirmed what I'd suspected. Trevor and Alexis had been criminally sloppy in their execution of what they considered a brilliant scheme. Their communications could be subpoenaed, their financial transactions could be traced, and their conspiracy could be documented in ways that would satisfy even the most demanding federal prosecutors. But beyond the criminal implications, their betrayal had taught me something invaluable about my own capabilities that 8 years of supporting Trevor's ambitions had obscured. I wasn't just competent at financial analysis and strategic planning. I was exceptionally gifted at understanding complex systems and finding ways to manipulate them for specific outcomes. Trevor had spent our entire marriage benefiting from my expertise while convincing me that my contributions were merely supportive rather than essential. Now I realized that every success he'd achieved had been amplified by strategic insights and analytical capabilities that I'd been providing, while he claimed credit for the results. The student who'd been systematically underestimated was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when superior strategic thinking met unlimited motivation for justice. Trevor and Alexis had created their own masterclass in sophisticated betrayal, never realizing they were teaching their victim how to destroy them, with methods far more devastating than anything they'd ever imagined. The call that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in this war came at exactly 3:17 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks before Trevor's planned destruction of my life. I was reviewing financial statements in my Cascade office when my assistant buzzed through with news that would transform me from a defensive player into the architect of my opponent's complete annihilation. Victoria, there's a Patricia Blackwell from Meridian Legal Group on line 3. She says it's regarding an urgent matter involving criminal financial activity that requires your immediate expertise. Patricia Blackwell was Oregon's most feared federal prosecutor, someone whose reputation for dismantling complex financial conspiracies had made her a legend in legal circles throughout the Pacific Northwest. Her involvement in any case meant that someone had committed crimes serious enough to warrant federal investigation, and her request for my expertise suggested that my professional background had caught the attention of law enforcement. Miss Sinclair, Patricia's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to commanding immediate attention. We've been monitoring suspicious financial activities involving several Portland-area businesses and individuals. Your name has surfaced in our investigation, not as a subject, but as someone whose expertise might be invaluable in understanding the sophisticated methods being employed. My heart raced as I realized the implications. What kind of financial activities are you investigating? Without revealing details that might compromise ongoing operations, I can tell you that we're looking at a pattern of business fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering that involves the systematic theft of marital assets through coordinated deception. The sophistication suggests perpetrators with significant financial knowledge and business connections. The description matched Trevor's activities so precisely that I knew federal investigators had already identified him as a target. But Patricia's next revelation exceeded my wildest expectations for justice. We have reason to believe that one of the subjects in our investigation may be involved in a broader pattern of financial crimes extending beyond individual cases. If our suspicions are correct, we're looking at potential RICO violations that could result in asset forfeiture and significant prison sentences. RICO violations. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, designed to prosecute sophisticated criminal enterprises. If federal prosecutors could prove that Trevor's activities constituted organized criminal behavior, everything he'd stolen could be seized by the government, and he could face decades in federal prison. Ms. Sinclair, your background in forensic financial analysis and your reputation for identifying complex fraud patterns makes you someone we'd like to consult with on a confidential basis. Would you be available for a meeting tomorrow afternoon to discuss how you might assist this investigation? I agreed immediately, understanding that the federal government had just handed me a weapon far more devastating than anything I could have created through private legal action. Trevor wasn't just facing divorce proceedings and civil fraud charges. He was being investigated by federal prosecutors with unlimited resources and the authority to destroy his life completely. The meeting the following day revealed the stunning scope of the federal investigation. Patricia had assembled a team of FBI financial crimes specialists, IRS criminal investigators, and federal prosecutors who'd been building a case against what they called the Portland Financial Conspiracy, a network of individuals using sophisticated business structures to commit large-scale fraud. Your husband's business activities first came to our attention through routine banking compliance reports, FBI Special Agent David Rodriguez explained, spreading financial documents across the conference table. Banks are required to report suspicious transactions, and Ashworth Digital Marketing has been generating red flags for the past 18 months. The red flags were devastating in their implications. Trevor had been moving money through business accounts in patterns that suggested money laundering, claiming business expenses for personal costs that constituted tax fraud, and using corporate structures to hide assets in ways that violated federal banking regulations. But the most damaging revelation was that Trevor wasn't working alone. The federal investigation had identified a network of accomplices who'd been helping him launder money and hide assets, including professional services from accountants, lawyers, and financial advisors who'd been facilitating criminal activity. Alexis Hammond has been receiving payments that she's failed to report on her tax returns, IRS criminal investigator Sarah Martinez noted. The consulting agreements are fraudulent. She's been providing personal services disguised as business consulting, which constitutes both tax evasion and conspiracy to commit fraud. The federal case was far more comprehensive than my private investigation had revealed. Trevor and Alexis weren't just betraying me personally. They'd been committing federal crimes that had attracted the attention of multiple law enforcement agencies. Their conspiracy had become evidence in a broader investigation of financial crime networks operating throughout Oregon. Ms. Sinclair, Patricia continued, we'd like to offer you the opportunity to cooperate with this investigation in ways that would ensure maximum recovery of your stolen assets while contributing to a federal prosecution that could prevent these individuals from victimizing others. Cooperation with federal prosecutors meant access to investigative resources that dwarfed anything available through private legal action. FBI surveillance capabilities, IRS forensic accounting, federal asset seizure authority, and prosecution teams with unlimited budgets and decades of experience dismantling sophisticated criminal organizations. But more importantly, federal cooperation meant that my personal vindication would become part of a larger justice effort that could destroy Trevor's ability to harm anyone else. His business would be seized, his assets forfeited, and his freedom eliminated through federal prison sentences, that would ensure he never again had the opportunity to systematically destroy someone's life. The cooperation agreement I signed that afternoon transformed me from an individual victim seeking personal justice into a federal witness with the full protection and support of the United States government. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered, every financial record I'd analyzed, every pattern of deception I'd identified, became part of a federal case file that would be presented to a grand jury within weeks. The timing was exquisite. Trevor's Project Exodus was scheduled for July 15th, but the federal indictments would be unsealed on July 10th. Instead of serving me divorce papers, Trevor would be arrested by federal agents and charged with conspiracy, money laundering, tax evasion, and racketeering. Instead of controlling the narrative of our separation, he'd be explaining his criminal activities to federal judges who had the authority to seize everything he'd stolen and sentence him to decades in federal prison. The asset protection component of the federal case exceeded anything I could have achieved through private legal action. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, everything Trevor had acquired through criminal activity could be seized by the government, then returned to his victims after prosecution was complete. This meant not only recovering what he'd stolen from our marriage, but also claiming damages for the psychological and financial harm his crimes had caused. But the most satisfying aspect of federal cooperation was understanding how completely Trevor had underestimated the consequences of his actions. He'd been so focused on outmaneuvering his naive wife that he'd ignored the federal laws he was violating and the law enforcement attention his activities were attracting. The sophisticated business structures he'd created to hide his fraud had actually made his crimes easier for federal investigators to document. Every corporate account, every fraudulent consulting agreement, every asset transfer he'd conducted to steal from our marriage had created a paper trail that federal prosecutors could follow with mathematical precision. Alexis's involvement had been equally helpful to federal investigators. Her communications with Trevor, her unreported income, and her participation in systematically defrauding me had created evidence of conspiracy that satisfied federal racketeering statutes. She'd transformed from Trevor's accomplice into his co-defendant, facing identical charges and identical prison sentences. The federal investigation had also revealed activities I hadn't discovered during my private research. Trevor had been defrauding other clients, stealing from business partners, and conducting financial crimes that extended far beyond his betrayal of our marriage. The systematic theft of my assets was apparently just one component of a broader criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. Patricia Blackwell's final briefing left me with a sense of justice that exceeded anything I'd imagined possible when I'd first discovered Trevor's betrayal. Ms. Sinclair, your cooperation will help us prosecute one of the most sophisticated financial fraud conspiracies we've encountered in this district. The evidence you've provided, combined with our ongoing investigation, should result in convictions that will send a clear message about the consequences of this type of criminal behavior. Federal prosecutors would handle the legal destruction of my opponents while I focused on rebuilding my life with assets that would be returned through government action. The psychological satisfaction of watching Trevor face federal charges would be amplified by the knowledge that his crimes would result in consequences far more severe than anything private legal action could have achieved. As I left the federal building that afternoon, I realized that Trevor and Alexis had committed crimes so serious that the United States government had become my ally in ensuring they faced appropriate consequences. The naive wife they'd planned to destroy had become a federal witness, whose testimony would help send them to federal prison. The power shift was complete. Instead of being Trevor's victim, I'd become his prosecutor. Instead of fighting for scraps in divorce court, I'd be recovering assets through federal asset forfeiture. Instead of seeking personal revenge, I'd be contributing to justice that would protect future victims from the criminals who'd assumed I was too naive to fight back effectively. July 15th would still arrive on schedule, but Trevor's Project Exodus had been canceled due to his upcoming federal indictment. The week leading up to the federal indictments became a masterclass in psychological warfare as I watched Trevor's carefully constructed world begin to collapse in ways he couldn't understand or control. Working closely with federal investigators, I helped orchestrate a series of seemingly unrelated pressures that would systematically destroy his confidence while gathering the final pieces of evidence needed for an airtight prosecution. The first domino fell on Monday morning when Trevor's largest client, Cascade Tech Solutions, terminated their contract without warning. From Trevor's perspective, this was a catastrophic business disaster that threatened the financial foundation of his entire operation. What he didn't know was that federal investigators had quietly briefed Cascade's legal team about the ongoing criminal investigation, strongly suggesting that maintaining business relationships with subjects under federal scrutiny might expose them to unwanted legal complications. "This makes no sense," Trevor muttered over breakfast, scrolling through the termination email on his phone with visible confusion. "They were completely satisfied with our performance metrics. The campaign we're running for them has exceeded every projected outcome." I offered sympathetic support while internally celebrating the precision of federal coordination. "Maybe it's just corporate restructuring," I suggested, refilling his coffee with the same attentive care I'd provided throughout our marriage. "Large companies make sudden changes all the time for reasons that have nothing to do with performance." But Trevor's business instincts were too sharp to accept simple explanations for complex problems. He spent the morning making frantic calls to contacts within Cascade, trying to understand what had triggered their sudden decision. The responses he received were diplomatically vague, but consistently final, the kind of corporate stonewalling that suggested serious legal concerns rather than routine business considerations. Tuesday brought a second wave of pressure that struck directly at Trevor's personal finances. His business banking relationship with Columbia River Financial, which had processed millions in transactions over 5 years, was suddenly terminated due to what the bank described as, quote, "updated compliance requirements and risk assessment protocols." Banking terminations were serious business in the financial world, often indicating that sophisticated monitoring systems had identified problematic activity patterns. For someone like Trevor, whose business operations depended heavily on complex financial transactions, losing banking relationships created immediate operational crises that threatened everything from payroll processing to client payment systems. "They're claiming my business profile has changed in ways that exceed their risk tolerance," Trevor explained to me that evening, his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled anxiety. 5 years of profitable relationship, and suddenly they decide I'm too risky? This feels coordinated, like someone's been talking to them. His paranoia was justified but misdirected. Trevor assumed he was facing corporate conspiracy or competitive sabotage from business rivals. He had no way of knowing that federal investigators had been systematically contacting his financial institutions, informing them that maintaining relationships with subjects under criminal investigation might expose them to regulatory scrutiny and potential penalties. Wednesday escalated the pressure into personal territory when Alexis received notification that her photography studio lease would not be renewed due to what the property management company called tenant conduct incompatible with building standards. The timing was devastating for their coordination, occurring just days before Trevor's planned divorce announcement when Alexis's emotional support would be most crucial. From my position as concerned wife, I offered to help Trevor understand what was happening to the people in his life. Maybe Alexis violated some lease requirement, I suggested during one of his increasingly frantic phone conversations with her. Commercial leases have strict terms about business activities and client interactions. But the pattern was becoming undeniable. Three separate institutions had simultaneously decided that their long-standing relationships with Trevor and Alexis were no longer acceptable. Trevor's analytical mind, trained to identify systematic problems in business operations, was beginning to recognize that these weren't isolated incidents but components of a coordinated campaign. Thursday brought the most psychologically devastating pressure yet, an audit notification from the Internal Revenue Service requesting comprehensive documentation of Ashworth Digital Marketing's business expenses for the past 3 years. IRS audits were among the most feared experiences in American business, capable of destroying companies through legal costs alone, regardless of the final findings. They want every receipt, every contract, every payment justification, Trevor said, staring at the official IRS letterhead with the expression of someone contemplating financial ruin. This is going to cost hundreds of thousands in accounting and legal fees, even if we're completely clean. The audit request was particularly damaging because Trevor knew his business expense documentation wouldn't survive sophisticated scrutiny. Years of claiming personal costs as business expenses, disguising payments to Alexis as consulting fees, and using corporate accounts for private activities had created a record of violations that professional auditors would identify immediately. But more frightening for Trevor was understanding that IRS audits weren't random events. Criminal referrals, whistleblower complaints, and suspicious activity reports triggered the kind of comprehensive investigation he was now facing. Someone with detailed knowledge of his financial activities had provided information that convinced federal tax authorities to launch a full forensic examination. "Victoria," he said that evening, his voice carrying undertones of desperation I'd never heard before, "I need you to help me understand something. Have you noticed anyone asking questions about our finances? Any unusual interest in our business activities or personal spending?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for, Trevor's growing realization that his problems weren't random, but might be connected to someone with intimate knowledge of his vulnerabilities. I maintained perfect composure while providing responses calculated to increase his paranoia without revealing my own involvement. "Now that you mention it," I said thoughtfully, "I did notice some unusual activity on our credit monitoring alerts. And didn't you say Marcus Chen had been asking questions about financial consulting services? I wondered why a private investigator would be interested in our consulting relationships." The mention of Marcus Chen hit Trevor like a physical blow. He understood immediately that private investigators didn't randomly inquire about financial services unless someone had hired them to examine specific activities. His face went ashen as he processed the implications of professional surveillance combined with his mounting business and legal problems. Friday brought the final pre-indictment pressure when Harrison Mills, Trevor's divorce attorney, called an emergency meeting to discuss what he described as unprecedented complications in their case strategy. Federal law enforcement had contacted Mills' office with questions about his client's financial activities that suggested potential criminal exposure beyond simple divorce proceedings. "Trevor, I need to ask you directly," Mills had said during their afternoon meeting, according to the recording devices federal investigators had authorized. "Are you involved in any financial activities that might constitute criminal behavior, money laundering, tax evasion, fraudulent business practices? Because federal attention suggests they have evidence of serious crimes." Trevor's response revealed his growing desperation. "I've been moving assets to protect them during divorce proceedings. That's completely legal, isn't it? Wealthy men always position their finances advantageously before major life changes." Mills's legal expertise recognized the difference between asset protection and criminal fraud. Moving marital assets without spousal knowledge or consent isn't asset protection, it's theft. If federal investigators are involved, They believe you've committed crimes that go beyond family law violations into federal criminal territory. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Trevor providing explanations that sounded increasingly like confessions to criminal activity. Every justification he offered for his behavior revealed additional violations that could be used against him in federal court. By Friday evening, Trevor was exhibiting the psychological stress of someone whose entire world was collapsing in ways he couldn't understand or control. His confident swagger had been replaced by anxious paranoia. His methodical planning had given way to reactive crisis management. His assumption of intellectual superiority had crumbled under pressure from opponents whose capabilities he'd completely underestimated. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. Trevor had spent 2 years planning my systematic destruction, believing he could control every aspect of the process through superior strategic thinking. Now he was experiencing the helplessness of being systematically dismantled by forces beyond his comprehension or control. Saturday brought a moment of personal satisfaction when Trevor asked directly whether I thought someone might be deliberately sabotaging his business and personal life. The man who'd spent years underestimating my intelligence was finally considering whether his naive wife might possess capabilities he'd never recognized. "Darling," I replied with the same supportive tone I'd used throughout our marriage, "successful people always face challenges from competitors and critics. Maybe this is just the price of your success attracting negative attention." But I could see in his eyes that Trevor was beginning to suspect the truth, that his carefully planned destruction of my life had somehow become his own destruction by opponents who'd learned his methods and turned them against him with devastating effectiveness. Monday morning would bring federal agents to his door with indictments that would transform his paranoia into reality and his suspicions into confirmed nightmares. The hunter had become the hunted, and he was finally beginning to realize that his prey had been far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Monday morning, July 10th, arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything feel sharp and inevitable. At exactly 6:47 a.m., while Trevor was in the shower preparing for what he believed would be a routine week leading up to his divorce announcement, 14 federal agents surrounded our penthouse building with arrest warrants that would transform his carefully planned future into a nightmare of criminal prosecution and financial ruin. I was in the kitchen preparing coffee when the first knock came, professional, authoritative, and unmistakably final. Through our security monitor, I could see FBI agents in tactical gear flanking our front door, while others secured the building's exits and parking garage. The coordination was flawless, designed to prevent any possibility of escape or evidence destruction. "Trevor," I called toward the bathroom, my voice carrying just the right note of confusion and concern. "There are police officers at our door, a lot of them." The water shut off immediately. I heard Trevor's sharp intake of breath, followed by the frantic rustling of someone getting dressed with desperate speed. He emerged from our bedroom, wearing hastily pulled-on clothes, his face already displaying the pale terror of someone whose worst fears were materializing faster than his mind could process. The second knock was more insistent. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for the arrest of Trevor Ashworth. Open the door immediately." Trevor's legs seemed to give out momentarily. He gripped the kitchen counter for support, staring at me with an expression that cycled through disbelief, terror, and finally, a dawning recognition that his life as he'd known it was ending in real time. "Victoria," he whispered, his voice breaking with panic. "I don't understand what's happening. Why would federal agents want to arrest me? This has to be some kind of mistake." I moved to the door with steady composure, placing my hand on the lock while turning to face the man who'd spent 2 years planning my destruction. For just a moment, I allowed him to see something different in my expression. Not confusion or fear, but calm satisfaction. "Actually, Trevor," I said quietly, "this isn't a mistake at all." His eyes widened as the implications of my tone penetrated his panic. "What do you mean?" "I mean that while you were planning Project Exodus and coordinating with Alexis to steal $8 million from our marriage, I was working with federal prosecutors to document every crime you've committed. The FBI has been building a criminal case against you for months, using evidence I provided about your systematic fraud, money laundering, and racketeering activities." The color drained from Trevor's face completely. You knew about Alexis? About the divorce planning?" "I've known everything since I found your Project Exodus files 6 weeks ago. I know about the 2 years of payments to Alexis for intelligence gathering. I know about the fraudulent business expenses, the hidden accounts, the systematic theft of marital assets, and your plan to leave me financially destroyed, while you started a new life with my former best friend." Trevor staggered backward, his analytical mind finally processing the scope of his miscalculation. "You've been planning this. You've been working against me while pretending to support me." The third knock was accompanied by a louder announcement. "Mr. Ashworth, you have 30 seconds to open this door before we execute our entry warrant." I unlocked the door and stepped aside as federal agents flooded into our penthouse with professional efficiency. Special Agent Rodriguez approached Trevor with handcuffs ready, while other agents began securing the premises for evidence collection. "Trevor James Ashworth," Rodriguez announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights were read, Trevor's eyes never left my face. I could see him struggling to reconcile the naive wife he'd been manipulating with the federal cooperator who'd orchestrated his arrest. The intellectual superiority he'd assumed throughout our marriage was crashing against the reality that I'd outmaneuvered him completely. "The offshore accounts," he said suddenly, understanding flooding his features. "You moved our money before I could access it. You've been liquidating assets." "I secured our joint assets from theft," I corrected. "Everything you tried to steal will be returned to me through federal asset forfeiture after your conviction. The $8 million you plan to take will remain exactly where it belongs, with the victim of your crimes rather than the criminal who tried to steal it." Federal agents were already executing search warrants throughout the penthouse, seizing computers, financial documents, and evidence that would support the comprehensive prosecution Patricia Blackwell's team had been building. Every piece of Trevor's careful documentation would now be used to prove his criminal intent rather than justify his divorce strategy. Agent Martinez approached with additional paperwork. "Ms. Sinclair, we'll need you to accompany us for processing as a federal witness. Your cooperation agreement provides protection and ensures your testimony will be properly documented for trial proceedings." As Trevor was led away in handcuffs, he turned back one final time. "Victoria, how long have you been planning this?" "Since the moment I realized you'd underestimated someone who'd been learning from you for 8 years, I replied. "You taught me everything I needed to know about strategic thinking, psychological manipulation, and systematic planning. I just applied those lessons better than you did." The arrest of Alexis Hammond occurred simultaneously at her photography studio, where federal agents found evidence of unreported income, conspiracy communications, and financial documents that confirmed her role in the criminal enterprise. Her cooperation with Trevor's fraud had made her equally culpable under federal racketeering statutes. The media coverage was swift and devastating. By noon, every major news outlet in Portland was reporting the federal arrests of a prominent business owner and his accomplice for sophisticated financial crimes. The narrative that emerged painted Trevor as a calculating criminal who'd systematically defrauded his own wife while building a business empire on fraudulent foundations. The financial consequences exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Federal asset forfeiture laws allowed the government to seize everything Trevor had acquired through criminal activity, including his business, properties, and investment accounts. The penthouse, the cars, the art collection, everything would be liquidated to compensate his victims and cover the costs of prosecution. But the criminal sentences were the most satisfying aspect of justice. Trevor's guilty plea 6 months later resulted in 12 years in federal prison, while Alexis received 8 years for her cooperation in the conspiracy. The financial crimes had been so well documented through their own communications and financial records that fighting the charges would have resulted in even harsher sentences. My testimony during the sentencing hearing provided the court with a comprehensive understanding of how their crimes had impacted not just my financial security, but my psychological well-being and trust in human relationships. Federal Judge Patricia Williams noted that the systematic nature of their deception warranted sentences that would deter others from similar criminal behavior. The defendants orchestrated a conspiracy that required years of planning, sophisticated financial knowledge, and complete disregard for their victims' rights and well-being, Judge Williams observed. Their crimes represent a level of premeditation and psychological manipulation that demands serious consequences. The civil proceedings that followed were merely administrative. With criminal convictions established, recovering the stolen assets became a matter of federal court orders rather than contested litigation. The $8 million Trevor had tried to steal was returned in full, along with additional damages for the costs of investigation and legal proceedings. But beyond the financial recovery, the federal prosecution provided something more valuable: complete vindication. The same intelligence and strategic thinking Trevor had dismissed as merely supportive had been recognized by federal prosecutors as exceptional analytical capability worthy of law enforcement cooperation. 6 months after Trevor's conviction, I established Sinclair Forensic Financial Consulting, specializing in cases involving sophisticated financial fraud and criminal enterprise investigations. My first client was the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, where my expertise in identifying complex fraud patterns had become invaluable for federal prosecutions. The private investigator Marcus Chen became my business partner, combining his surveillance capabilities with my financial analysis to create one of the most effective fraud investigation firms in the Pacific Northwest. Our client list grew to include federal agencies, major law firms, and corporations requiring sophisticated financial crime detection. 2 years after that Monday morning arrest, I attended Trevor's parole hearing as a victim impact witness. He looked older, diminished by prison life and the reality of his criminal consequences. When given the opportunity to address his victims, he offered what sounded like a prepared apology that acknowledged his crimes while avoiding responsibility for their impact. "Victoria," he said during the victim impact portion of the hearing, "I know my actions caused you tremendous harm. I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive the mistakes I made." "Trevor," I replied, standing to address both him and the parole board, "what you did weren't mistakes. They were carefully planned crimes that required years of deception and systematic cruelty. I've forgiven you, because holding on to anger would only continue to give you power over my life. But forgiveness doesn't mean minimizing the magnitude of your criminal behavior or supporting your early release." The parole board denied his application unanimously. As I left the federal courthouse that afternoon, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by Trevor's betrayal. The naive wife he'd planned to discard had become a successful entrepreneur whose expertise was sought by federal law enforcement agencies. The woman he'd systematically underestimated had built a career from the ruins of his criminal conspiracy. The greatest irony was that Trevor's crimes had ultimately provided me with opportunities I never would have discovered otherwise. His betrayal had forced me to recognize capabilities I'd never fully developed while supporting his ambitions. His systematic underestimation had motivated me to exceed every assumption he'd made about my potential. 3 years later, Sinclair Forensic Financial Consulting has offices in Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco, employing over 40 investigators and analysts who specialize in complex financial crime detection. Our success rate in federal criminal cases has made us the preferred consultant for white-collar prosecutions throughout the western United States. I still live in Portland, though in a different penthouse that I purchased entirely with proceeds from my own business success. The view of Mount Hood reminds me daily that some landscapes appear deceptively calm while concealing tremendous power beneath their surface. Trevor will be eligible for parole again in 2031. By then, I'll have spent more years building my independent success than I ever spent supporting his ambitions. The woman who was supposed to be destroyed by his betrayal will have become everything he never imagined she could be. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just survival, it's transformation into someone so successful that your former oppressor's worst fears about their own inadequacy become permanent reality. The student had indeed surpassed the teacher, and the lesson was complete. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.